집이었습니다.
I am that I am by blood.
Forever is the strangest thing. It's shorter than you think. No think.
First inhabitants, the Wale Indians. Within a few decades, European disease, slavery, and pirate attacks had greatly diminished the Wale population. There they go. They went extinct. They about to tell us. There we go, the same story. By 1662, Natchez was a ghost town, and the surviving Wale had retreated first to nearby St. Catherine's Island and later to Alameda Island in Florida. It's still around here. It's still around here. This right here is interesting right here. It's a land of Wale. Wale territory extended from the river Dulce, Savannah River. Was that the first name of Savannah River? I didn't know. I learned something. To the southern tip of Santa Catalina Island, engaged by French and English attacks on a Spanish ship carrying gold from South America. King Philip II of Spain ordered the founding of St. Augustine in 1562. Present-day landmarks are shown in green. Stono Rebellion, 1739. The Stono Rebellion, the largest slave insurrection in British North America, began nearby on September 9, 1739. About 20 Africans raided a store near Wallace Creek, a branch of Stono River. Taking guns and other weapons, they killed 2 shopkeepers. The rebels marched south toward promised freedom in Spanish Florida, waving flags, beating drums, and shouting, "Liberty, liberty, liberty."
Longing is the music of our sphere. The gift of life is never more or less. It starts at any time you like and ends in just a wink. Pass me the light, baby.
Peace, 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 peace. Hashtag BOTG, we're back. How y'all doing? I hope y'all enjoying the Power series we bringing y'all. This is part of Power 5 we doing right now. What I'm telling you right now is part of what's called, it was once called Negro Creek, right? Then they changed all the way to Freedom Creek. This is not the actual place is in the back part. It's gated off, but this is connecting waters. And this was, since we're doing part 5 and we're dealing with the Gullah Geechee Wars, the Seminole Wars, the 100-Year Wars. And you know, back I like to do boots on the ground, hashtag BOTG with back. So we get the books and the looks, and we put boots on the ground and bring tangibles to the game. Right now, we're in Savannah, Georgia. This is Skidaway Island, and Freedom Creek is what it's now called. Now that creek was used for so-called runaways escaping to Florida during 1785 for almost 100 years. Now, they talk about the running up north, the Harriet Tubman, that went until 1850s, right? Somewhere around that time. So this creek would have been used during the Gullah Geechee Wars, the Seminole Wars, the 100-Year War to get to free Spanish-held Florida. And like I said, it's the actual place where I really want to take y'all. It's gated up now, which I think is a shame. It should be a historical site, but it's gated up. But this runs around the back to where the so-called free people or enslaved people, and I believe they are indigenous also because of the ties and the mixtures. And they would have went this way around. It's called, now you can look it up, it's called Freedom Creek. It was runaway Negro Creek, Negro Creek, and it also was used during the Civil War. But right now, getting to Freetown, Florida, getting to free Florida, during that town, this is part of the waterways. So hashtag BOTG, we're back. You know, hope y'all enjoying the series. It's Power, part 5, and we're gonna continue to keep it going. 100, 100. Power. Critical 1740 Battle of Bloody Mose. Fort Mose became a haven for runaway slaves, Indians, blacks, and whites. In 1693, after King Charles II of Spain decreed that any slave who reached Spanish Florida would be freed in exchange for converting to Catholicism and joining the Spanish militia. January 1740, Governor James Overthought of Georgia launched a military operation into Spanish Florida, where allies from the Cherokee, Creek, Carolina militia, and Scottish Highlanders, 42 Battalion. Wow, they brought everybody. To know more about James Overthought, check out my video that's on my page, YouTube. Quote, "And I do further declare that all Negroes which have deserted from South Carolina and which shall be taken in Florida during this said expedition shall be delivered up to their respective owners on paying the sum of £5 sterling per head to their captors. James Overthought," end quote.
We here at the Fort Mose Militia accepts the King's charge, and we promise to fight to the last drop of our blood to protect Fort Mose and St. Augustine.
1738, Governor Manuel de Montenegro establishes Garcia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose, commonly known as Fort Moses, the first free African-American settlement in what is now the United States. Francisco Menendez, a Mandingo man formerly enslaved by the British, is appointed captain of the Fort Mose Free Black Militia. When the British forces from Georgia attacked St. Augustine in 1740, Montenegro ordered the people of Mose to abandon their settlement and to fall back to St. Augustine for safety. Fort Mose was captured by the British, but Spanish soldiers and the Mose militia regained it in a surprise attack that devastated the British forces, but the fort was lost and destroyed. Also, Menendez fought in the 1715 Yamasee Wars on the Indian side. After the
domestic wars, many Creek, Hittichi, Yamasee, and Miccosukee Indians moved to Florida. Together they became known as the Seminoles. Although most blacks were technically governed by Seminole chiefs, they were free in every other way. They were armed, most lived in their own villages, and as a kind of tax, gave corn to the tribe. They taught the Indians to build homes, tend livestock, and speak English and Spanish. That doesn't sound like slavery to me. Side note, that sounds like family building together off the spider web. We take care of the village. 100.
People of African descent have been coming to Florida and part of Florida since it was known to exist in Europe. Ponce de Leon had free black sailors and soldiers with him. There were probably black soldiers or sailors at least, with Pedro Menendez. We know that immediately he rescued a lot of the captives from shipwrecks, particularly in South Florida, and among them were a number of African heritage or mixed blood mulatto people. And they had been here even before Menendez. And it's sort of interesting to think about the capture of all of these shipwreck victims over the years before Florida was settled, because not all of the first slaves here were black. Most of them, in fact, were white, but they were slaves of the Calusa and the Timucua.
The Seminoles of Florida were expert cattlemen. Their skills kept them from starving when soldiers pushed them deeper into the wilderness, prairies, and marshlands. Often Seminoles slaughtered the wild shrub cattle, a tough breed descended from the herds brought from Spain in the 1500s. So understand, family, when they say they was going to Florida to go and get slaves back, Florida was fertile. You can grow cattle, you can grow a lot of crops there. But see, the Seminoles were trading cattle with Cuba and Spain for weaponry. And they wasn't trading with the newly formed United States of America, so-called.
No, sir!
In his 1976 book, Florida Cowman, Joe A. Ackerman Jr. writes that the Seminoles survived to elude soldiers, quote, because of the speed and the efficiency by which they could slaughter, dry, and jerk beef on the trail. Quote, an army marches on its stomach, end quote, Napoleon Bonaparte. Ackerman and other historians say the roots of the Seminole Wars included the cattle rustling and raids that resulted from disputes between settlers and Seminoles for the rangeland of unsettled Florida frontier. Now, the first recorded participation in organized cattle ranching by the Seminole tribe occurred in the 1740s. After the Spanish left Florida, the wild herds of beef cattle that remained were gathered by some Seminole communities. The fighting begins over Florida beef cattle. In 1775, there are records that report that the Seminole tribe was working a massive herd of 7,000 to 10,000 cattle on Pines Prairie. They also actively used trained cow dogs, which later became known as Florida cracker curds. Wow, I never heard that term, Florida cracker curds for the dogs. So understand, family, find yourself in the story, your family story within the story, and let's build. Seminole Wars, Part 1. Let's go. The Seminoles and Black Seminoles were aligned with the British against the Americans before and during the War of 1812, and were the targets of frequent raids by militia from Georgia, who sought runaway slaves as well as land and cattle. In 1816, U.S. soldiers destroyed a garrison that was a refuge for escaped slaves, killing some 270 people. Wow. The Negro Fort Massacre. The Samuel George Morton Cranial Collection, Historical Significance and New Research. Racist.
Back, who is this guy and what does he have to do with the Gullah Seminole Wars?
I got you.
For sure.
100.
Alright.
Morton was a Philadelphia physician and was considered one of the United States' greatest scientists. He supported polygenome through his works measuring human skull volumes. He measured modern and ancient skulls and concluded that the human race or species could be ranked on a scale of intelligence. Here we go. His measurements showed that modern Caucasians, his term, skulls had the highest volume, followed by Chinese skulls. American Indian skulls had the lowest volume. Damn. Morton found that the volume of African skulls were third in the line, above both South Asians and the American Indian. Dr. Morton's catalog included Egyptian mummies, Peruvian skulls that had cranial enlargement extended, Vikings from Finland, Romans and Greeks, Hindu and Chinese burials, South Pacific Islanders, and of course, many Native American tribes, some from Aboriginal Indian mounds. Wow, the man had everybody head on the rack. Half a dozen Cherokee, 4 Creeks, 3 Yamasee from a mound in Tampa, but the biggest tribe represented by far are the skulls from 16 Seminoles, with half the U.S. Army in Florida, physicians, explorers, and other patrons of Dr. Morton. The Florida Seminoles were a field ripe for the picking. Ripe for the picking. Ain't that a shame? Wickedness. So during the war times, family, they was taking the bodies, shipping them to this guy, Dr. Morton, and his goons, and defecating the body, cutting the heads off, and I guess melting off the skin to examine skull sizes for someone's fantasy or science. This is crazy. This is crazy.
The great Seminole warrior Chief Osceola also had his head decapitated. This is said to be his death mask. Wicked people.
Here's a list of the Seminoles that were sent, and you can see who sent them and what date. This is during wartime. We can't even bury our dead peacefully. To the ancestors, rest in power. This is one of my new books. It's called A Diplomatic History of the American People. This is the 10th edition by Thomas A. Bailey. And it has something to do with the wars we're dealing with right now. We're going to go ahead and go here. This is page 164 of the book, Acquiring the Floridas, 1803, 1821. You can see where the Florida's at, family. So you got Florida, present-day Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, going into Louisiana. That's West Florida, and this is East Florida. You see the dates. So reason we here now, you know, they always say they was going into Florida, right? Because the slaves was running, going to get the slave. Let's read what this book said, what the real reason was. And we're gonna skip around a little bit, but we will revisit the book. Raw acres of Florida by no means was the sole attraction. The huge peninsula thrust deeply into the Gulf of Mexico possessed vital strategic value, offering as it did a constant threat to shipping between New Orleans and the Atlantic seaboard. In addition, most of the navigable rivers of the present state of Alabama and Mississippi ran through the east and west of Florida while seeking the Gulf. So that's really where they wanted it for, you know? And then we go here to Thomas Jefferson. Like I said, this is 1803. You wasn't getting no slaves in 1803. So this is the real reason. This is what Thomas Jefferson said as he was on his way out of office. And you can see, it says, we must have the Floridas and Cuba. Quote, this is Thomas Jefferson, right? And then President Madison comes in and he goes after West Florida, infiltrating West Florida. It's a great book. We're gonna continue to get some more out of this book. You're gonna see. So they move from West Florida and the East Florida. Let's flip the page real quick. Let's flip the page real quick. We're gonna get back to it. Okay, so this is what it was saying far as what was going on in Florida. Far more irritating were the Indians of Florida, joined by runaway Negroes, here they go, white renegades and others. They periodically, sailed across the international lines to pillage, burn, and murder. Now this is the scapegoat. What they picked. This is what the reason they said they was going into Florida, which we know was not the truth. All right, we'll be back with this book. There's a lot going on, and we'll be back. Let's go.
British Colonel Nichols left behind a large supply of arms, artillery, and ammunition to protect the inhabitants from slave raiders, to protect themselves, and to commission raids on southern plantations. Now that was the payback. When they were coming in Florida and try to say they're going to get slaves, they would go back and retaliate, right? The payback. They were supplied with 2,500 stands of musketry, 500 carbines, 500 steel saber swords, 4 cases containing 200 pistols, 300 quarter casks of rifle powder, 160 barrels of cannon powder, and a large count of military stores. What Trick Daddy said on back in the days, the blacks got the gas. They definitely was ready for war, but they was a peaceful people like they always been, still today. They was building on their farms, building up their community, and jealousy is what happened. We can see that when you deal with so-called Black Wall Street in the 1920s. Let's go. On the walls of the fort were mounted 4 long 24-pounder cannons, 4 long 6-pounder cannons, a 4-pounder fear-piercing, and a 5.5-inch howitzer. They definitely were strapped. The community surrounding the fort was attractive for its defensive position and cultivated lands. Runaway slaves were pouring in on a daily basis. The community grew to about 1,000 blacks in the fields surrounding the fort. A total of 300 black men, women, and children were in the possession of the fort, accompanied by about 20 Choctaw and a number of Seminoles. They was working the spot web, living together peacefully. Joshua Giddings vividly depicts the Fort Negro. Quote, their plantations extended along the river several miles above and below the fort. Many of them possessed large herds of cattle and horses, which roamed the forest, gathering their foods both in summer and winter, without expense or trouble to their owners. Even the animals were at peace. Wow. The pioneers exiled from South Carolina had settled here long before the colony of Georgia existed. Several generations had lived to manhood and died in those forest homes. To their descendants, it had become consecrated by many an old told tale of early adventures, of hardships and suffering, the recollection of which had been retained in tradition, told in stories, and sung in their rude lays. You know, like we have oral tradition still passed down. Same thing. Here were graves of their ancestors around whose memories were clustered the fondest recollection of human mind. The climate was genial. They were surrounded by extensive forests and far removed from the habitations of those enemies of freedom who sought to enslave them, and they regarded themselves as secure in the enjoyment of liberty. See what I'm saying? Just wanted to live and be free. Okay, let's continue. Shout out from the cares and the stripes of civilized men. They were happy in their own solitude, social solitude. So far from seeking the injuries of the people of the United States, they were only anxious to be exempt and entirely free from all the contacts with our population or government, while they faithfully maintained their alliance to the Spanish crown. End quote. That's all they was doing, was chilling. Ain't wanted nothing to do with your government, nothing to do with your people and your laws. Y'all stay over there, stay out of our business and leave us alone. Still a day. But now I can't leave you alone. You know, gotta bring strife. You know? Nah. Shout out to the ancestors. Let's continue. The fort was becoming a growing threat to slavery itself. The existence of an autonomous free black community was intolerable alone, but it became a rallying point for runaway slaves fleeing from other southern states. Now, when they say runaway slaves, understand, don't put that same complexion that television and the media and some of these schools, they always show one complexion of a person and origin where they come from. That is not truth. Right? Slavery was a big business. Anybody could be enslaved. And you was running away from that. So people band together. So let's make sure we understand. Get rid of all those fallacies, all those foolishness, paintbrush pictures, all those fake pictures, and just saying it's just one type of person, one type of complexion that was enslaved. Let's continue. The blacks were less concerned about committing depredations as was depicted by the U.S. military officials. So the military was lying, using that scapegoat. Then they were about protecting their own freedoms. As Gideon describes, they were happy in their own social solitude, finally free and safe after decades of harassment and terror. Just don't want to be left alone, live our life. Shout out to the ancestors. And yes, some of y'all are not your ancestors. They didn't never lay down and say slavery, slavery, slavery. Never, ever, ever. Always stood up and fought back. Yeah, one time. They had the means for sufficient provisions with no reason to attack the frontier settlers. As much as the expansionists wished to depict them as outlaws, they could not attribute them to not even one instance of murder or theft. See the lies, the lies, the lies. Sound like a bunch of war crimes was going on. Let's take them to court. General Andrew Jackson, this guy, knew that the slaves were not actually stolen. They were runaway from slaveholders who sought refuge at the fort with the promise of abundance and freedom under the protection of the free blacks. Most of the black warriors and family had been free for generations. Their ancestors had fled their masters to Spanish Florida many decades before. Plus, Jackson's request to the Spanish governor only gave a facade of legitimacy to the inevitable designs of the U.S. government. On April 8, 2 weeks before Jackson wrote the Spanish governor, he ordered General Gaines to destroy the Negro Fort, regardless of its location and on Spanish territory. Now that right there in itself is a war crime. You're crossing international borders to bring war upon people in a free area. Now listen here now, boy. I had told you ain't no slaves down here. Ain't no slaves here. Anybody seen any slaves down here? No, sir. I told y'all that hundreds and hundreds of years ago. We are deep rooted in this land. We've been here. We saw the boats pull up when you got here. We've been free. We asked the chief. Chief, something else. You seen any slaves? Chief, something else. You seen any slaves? The chief just puffing on his peace pipe with his war paint on. That's what I see.
Quiet down, quiet down. I have little doubt of the fact that this fort has been established by some villains for rapine and plunder. And it ought to be blown up, regardless of the land on which it stands. We are Americans. We are white. We are the true owners. But if your mind should form the same conclusion as I, destroy it and return these stolen Negroes to the property of their rightful owners and get rid of them.
Lieutenant Colonel Duncan Lamont Clinch was assigned to destroy the fort. Clinch had his own interests when it came to the fort, being among the most prosperous slaveholders of Florida. So you got the military, personnel that's into slavery, the presidents, the government. This is crazy, but it's how it was. He undoubtedly felt that his profit interests were threatened by its continued existence. Talking about Fort Negro, right? Now, Gaines ordered him to speedily establish a fort near the junction of the Flint and the Chattahoochee rivers, where they joined to form the Apalachicola River to intimidate the fort, Negro Fort. See, they go to set up. Now watch how they get more wicked. Clinch was to meet the convoy of supplies from New Orleans with 50 soldiers. Once he was informed that they had arrived at the river, the convoy was detached with 2 gunboats from the point. Gaines ordered him to proceed to Negro Fort, where if he was to meet with opposition, then arrangements will immediately be made for its destruction. Check him out. Gaines wished to provoke an attack to justify the destruction of the fort.
The scapegoat.
To justify the destruction of the fort and the murder and the massacre of innocent people.
Men, women, and children.
Colonel Clinch commenced to the Negro Fort. He left with about 116 soldiers and incidentally met a party of slave-hunting Creeks led by Chief McIntosh. Remember, that's William McIntosh. He's mostly Scottish-Irish, right? He's Highlander, right? A little bit of Indian, if that in him. But we talk about him in Power 4. Get all the power so you can understand, and understand what we're doing with the Power series thus far. All right? The Winter Chiefs, Creeks, numbered about 150. They had been hired by General Jackson to capture slaves in the Apalachicola offered $50 for every slave they seized and returned to their owners. A council was held where the Creeks agreed to keep parties in advance and capture every black that they discovered. Every black that they discovered. So how did they differentiate from the so-called indigenous Indians and the so-called blacks? What is that? Is it looking at the complexion? Because it says, when we look at the history, it says everybody that came to the shore said everybody was dark-skinned, melanated, either looked like Ethiopians. So what is really going on? How you differentiate? Is it a phenotype or is it all bull?
You a lying mother.
On the 23rd, the Creeks demanded that the blacks surrender, but they responded defiantly.
What? Who the hell is you?
The black commander, again, who is black? What is going on? Another construct. Garcon told the deputation of Creeks he would sink any American vessel that should attempt to pass it, and he would blow up the fort if he couldn't defend it. He a rider. The blacks then hoisted the English Union Jack, accompanied with the red flag over the fort. Now we know the red flag, that's your Red Stick Creeks. You know, that's who was in the fort also. You know, they keep calling them blacks, but I believe it's showing that they are the Red Stick faction, because you had the white flag and you had the red flag of the Creeks. So let's continue. The blacks knew that surrender would only mean slavery, so there would be no compromise. For the next several days, the blacks opened fire whenever any troop appeared in their view. On July 27th, the gunboats approached the fort. The blacks opened fire when they entered into the gunshot range. The gunboats fired back with some cold shots to get an idea of their real distance. I don't think that's true, but let's continue. The gunboats then fired the first hot one, made red hot in the cook's gallery, which went screaming over the wall and into the fort magazine full of gunpowder. The fort completely exploded. Colonel Clinch reported to horrific destruction. Let's see what he had to say about it. Quote,
"The explosions was awful and the scene horrible beyond description. Our first act of care on arriving at the scene of description was to rescue and relieve the unfortunate black beings who survived the explosion. The war yells of Indians, the cries of lamentations of the wounded, compelled the soldiers to pause in the midst of victory to drop a tear for the sufferings of his fellow beings, and to acknowledge that the great ruler of the universe, God, must have used as his instruments in chastising the bloodthirsty murderous wrenches that defends this fort."
end quote. Benjamin Hawkins. You know, we talked about Benjamin Hawkins in Power 4 again. He was the Indian agent. You know, he was appointed by George Washington in the 1770s, right? So now, what we got to understand about him, especially if you got lineage tied to the Southeast tribes, as I do myself. So let's go ahead and read a little bit about what they talking about, what he said. And shout out to my daughter, Cool Kid, with the artwork that's behind there. Yeah, GWG, support the youngins. Buy our artwork now, because the price is going up. But let's get back to it. 100. Benjamin Hawkins, America's highest-ranking Indian agent in the South, learned of the fort occupation of the armed fugitive slaves residing within. He dubbed the free black community Negro Fort. The term stuck. So that's where it comes from, according to militaryhistorynow.com. Let's continue to go. In the coming weeks and months, Hawkins and a number of prominent frontier citizens and officials flooded Washington with reports of rebellious slaves and their savage Indians allies running wild across the southern frontier. Wow, somebody come help. Guess what happened though? The accounts were almost entirely exaggerated.
The scapegoat.
Now, who gonna justify these murders?
Follow the waters and wars, and then follow the money. Somebody always has to back this operation. Let's get back to the illegal destruction and murder and massacre of Negro Fort.
He gave a defined justification for the massacre in the official report, but he also wrote a far more descriptive alternative account of the event without involving God. Here we go, let's see, quote.
The explosion was awful, and the scene horrible beyond description. You cannot conceive, nor I describe the horrors of the scene. In an instant, lifeless bodies were stretched upon the plains, buried in the sand and rubbish, or they were suspended from the tops of the surrounding pines. Here lay an innocent baby, there her helpless mother. On one side, a storied warrior, on the other, a bleeding spawn. Piles of bodies, large heaps of sand, broken guns, and excrements covered the site of the fort. The brave soldier was disarmed of his resentment and checks his victorious career to a teardrop on his distressing scene of what he'd witnessed.
End quote. The terrible explosion instantly killed 270 black men, women, and children within the fort. Understand, when they say black men, women, and children, these are mostly indigenous people tied to the tribes that was in that fort that happened to. And it says, the rest being mortally wounded. Out of the total 330 residents, only a few survived. The black commander Garcon and the Choctaw chief, we don't have a name, I wish we did, somehow managed to survive the explosion. The Creek sentenced them to death for the murder of 4 U.S. soldiers. Now, the Creeks that they're talking about is under McIntosh that we spoke about earlier. This is a different fraction of the Creeks. Make sure we get that understood. You dig what I'm saying? So it said the Creeks sentenced them to death for the murder of 4 U.S. soldiers. They learned that the blacks had tarred and feathered the captured soldiers. Speculation. The Creeks immediately executed them afterwards. And that's a gruesome story that when they told how they executed them, right? Okay, some 6 of the blacks were captured and immediately returned to their speculated masters. That is, if they were ever held in bondage at all. And we know that word bondage means slavery. Remember that word bondage. I'm going to tie that into something later. Bondage, right? Make sure we get that. The large number of runaway slaves on the field that surrounded the rivers scattered about safely. Some fled to the protection of the blacks and the Seminoles at the Suwannee, that is an indigenous name, right? And others left to grow in free black communities just south of Tampa Bay, Florida. Tampa Bay is heavy because that's where Hernando de Soto went. That's another bill. I just want to make sure we breaking it down. Right? The elimination of the fort was not the end of the black Seminoles' social structure in Florida. Nah, it was not. Here we go. Continue to go. Several of the black communities remained largely intact, but it was far from the end of the terror inflicted on the black Seminoles by the federal government. Who's your enemy, family? Who's your enemy? It was far from the end of their resistance either. They would strive to avenge the loss of their family members and loved ones. They will strive to avenge. I'ma get you back. So now you get into the Seminole Wars Part 2. Yeah, and 3. So let's get to it, family. Part 2 of the Gullah Geechee, the 100-Year War, the Seminole Wars is coming up. Back for What's Mine on YouTube. Make sure you like, subscribe. Welcome to the swamp.